everybody. Welcome. We're psyched that you came over to the fourth floor for Ingrid Burrington to tell us about her work. Ingrid is awesome. We're very, very psyched to have her here in Chattanooga. She's an artist in New York City. She's currently a fellow at the Data and Society think tank there, which is pretty hardcore. It's a project of Dana Boyd, who wrote a book that everybody should actually read here called It's Complicated, The Secret Life of Networking Kids, or something like that. It's amazing. Really cool to have an artist part of that particular think tank. Before that, she was a resident at IBEAM, Center for kind of connecting art and technology, also in New York. And she's really just done a bunch of cool work. And so I'm going to leave it at that and hand it over, and thank you for being
here. Do you need the mic for the live, because maybe they can all hear me, but maybe, okay, I'll just use this microphone. Okay. Hi guys. So thank you so much to Nate for inviting me while I was in town. This is like super cool. Hi. Let's see. My name is Ingrid. I tend, when people ask me about sort of my art and what I do, I tend to say that I make maps and I tell jokes. And just a little bit of housekeeping of like associations, data, and these are just things you can go check out. Data and Society, as Nate mentioned, is a think tank based in New York that I'm involved with. Great people doing some really interesting stuff. I'm also part of an art collective called Deep Lab, and currently our website is a paste bin, so the Twitter is probably a better way to see what we're up to. I'm also currently co-teaching a class at the School for Poetic Computation, which is an artist-run school in the Lower East Side in New York that's really great and would definitely recommend checking out. They're just doing some really cool stuff there, and I'm really happy to be involved with them. And I'm going to be mostly talking to you about a project that I worked on while I was a resident at IBEAM, which, as Nate mentioned, is a really fantastic organization. And a lot of that this project that I'm going to be telling you about kind of starts with this like deceptively simple question, which is, how do you see the internet? And most people, this is kind of how they see the internet, which is like to say they use it, often to look at pictures of cats. But that's sort of maybe how you like interface with the internet, right? That's like how you experience it. But like if you wanted to like see and comprehend it as like a whole thing, what you usually end up seeing are like network diagrams that kind of are like super abstract and that has very little relationship to how you interface with something, or you get like really weird metaphors that don't fully convey what you're actually dealing with. Like I have lots of feelings about the cloud as a thing. Maybe we can get into that later. And maybe people here have those feelings too. Because, you know, like ultimately, like, this is what the cloud looks like. This is an Amazon data center in Northern Virginia, and like, it's like a real thing, and like two, it's not something that is easy to find. It was like kind of annoying trying to figure out where it was, and you know, once I got there, they didn't really want me to be there. So I think that this is something that probably for this kind of audience maybe goes without saying, but I don't know, maybe a few years ago people started to kind of acknowledge that the distinction between like internet life and real life is kind of imaginary, right? Like everything that happens online has consequences offline, and I think that part of what's been still missing from that like understanding is the fact that like everything that happens online happens like within objects, and all of this stuff is like real stuff, you know, and it's just a bunch of infrastructure. It's like acritical infrastructure, the same way that, you know, water and gas lines are infrastructure, right? And the problem is the infrastructure is that it's kind of tricky to sometimes get people excited about it, right? This is sometimes what has happened to me, or what other people have done when I've started to try and excitedly talk to them about infrastructure. They become sleepy bunnies. This audience, maybe not so much. I feel like this is a really cool town for infrastructure, which has been super, super cool. But you know, it kind of makes sense, right? Like this isn't stuff that's designed like to be like, or at this time in like our history isn't really designed for people to get like excited about it. It's something that's sort of, you're only really supposed to notice if it breaks. And it's stuff that like often people don't want you to see, like, part of my inspiration for even getting into this topic was like discovering how hard it was for anyone to just tell me, like, so where are the cables? Like, if I wanted to like see like a route of like where all the fiber optic cables in New York City are, turns out people don't just want you to have that for a lot of reasons. Often a reason given is, you know, national security, but I think like we can talk more about whether that's a legitimate criticism later, but largely because it's very lucrative information to have. Like, it's valuable real estate data. It's valuable business intelligence, and people don't want you to just have that, especially in a city like New York where like property is kind of like at the heart of everything. That being said, like, it's actually pretty easy to find out a lot of this stuff if you want to. I like kind of think it's important to be clear, like, I'm not an expert. I'm not coming at this from having like a lot of experience with this. This was something I just became curious about and started digging. I mean, and there's public information about internet exchanges all over the world. Telegeography does a really good job with that. And if you want to find things like where submarine cable landings are, because the submarine cable data that's public isn't perfectly accurate, it's actually pretty easy to find like the FCC like cable landing license agreements, which tell you exactly where all the landing sites are, down to their like actual coordinates. And then if you're me and you're in Northern California, you take a day to drive up to Mendocino County and go sightseeing once you have that information. That's at a very particular scale of seeing the internet though, and that's sort of like, that's information you can glean that might not, that you kind of have to go out of your way to go find anything out about. Like, you know, that was like kind of an adventure, right? So what happens when you try to like scale it down? And like, if I wanted to see, get a sense of like how much of like the network, as it were, was around me like at a random city intersection, where would you start? That was sort of where I started. And one of the first things you can do, at least, okay, this picture is an example, like, is you look down, right? And you've probably all seen these spray painted markings. You see them on the street all the time. They're put down basically in advance of like street repairs, so that, you know, if you're like opening up the street to do some work on the gas lines, you don't kill the power grid for like half of a neighborhood. And they're all color coded, and they all refer to different like utilities, and the orange ones are all telecommunications related. So once I started looking for them, I couldn't really stop. It's kind of, has anyone in here read the book The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon? All right, cool. So, yeah, all right, you get it. But they're like, it's like hobo codes. Like, you kind of just like get really, like they kind of just show up everywhere once you want to find them. And there's other things that you kind of start to notice, like manhole covers. Those are often like a useful indicator of like what's under the ground. There's other stuff that's like you can look down and then you can look up. These are things called distributed antenna systems that exist in New York. They're just like a way to improve cell reception within a very dense urban area like New York, which has lots of tall buildings. It's been really cool actually being here and seeing so many like giant visible cell towers. Most of the ones in New York are on roofs, and so it's not very exciting. Although you guys don't really disguise them, which I think, like, I don't know how many people have seen that, but that's like also one of my favorites is like the cell towers that look like pine trees, or the cell tower that looks like a cactus. Just like a weird thing that I kind of enjoy, if you guys have seen that. But, you know, just because I can see all of those things doesn't mean that like, and I can like point them out to people, that doesn't make them something that anyone can understand. Like a lot of this stuff, you know, infrastructure is something that's hidden in plain sight, right? So I worked on this project to try and figure out how to make that something that people would notice and see and annoyingly stare at the way that I stare at it all the time, which became a website that had a bunch of illustrations and information about different companies and different markings, and then also was a book, which is designed to be kind of like a field guide, basically. So if you were walking around New York City and you found something on the street, you could flip through all of these different drawings of different markings and figure out what it was, or look for a manhole cover and see what it was. And let's see, where did I go from this next part? This is a picture I took yesterday, because I realized, like, I give this talk or versions of this talk and talk about this project, usually in contexts where, like, people aren't already super jazzed about infrastructure, and it's not something that's like already super present. And you don't really get things like this in urban environments. These are, I mean, I'm guessing people have seen things like these. These are like the big like markings that tell you that there's a fiber optic cable buried somewhere. And this is on like that office compound where the Amazon fulfillment center is. And I like, it's been super fun for me finding all of these, and just like, I get giddy just knowing like, oh, cool, hi internet. And it makes sense, right? Like I like really, it makes sense that this is a city where like infrastructure would be kind of cared for and very visible and something you might like kind of be into, because like you have stuff like this, like you guys have some really sweet dams. And it's been super fun. And like we don't live, like America doesn't really have a tendency so much to like celebrate stuff like this anymore, right? Like you don't like have a visitor center for like AWS like EC2 East. Like that's not like a thing. And I kind of think it should be, even though it's something that's like admittedly like, you know, as someone was saying to me this morning, like every data center pretty much looks the same. It's just a question of like how much messier it is than any other. But I think that that's valuable for people to see and understand. You know, like this is how I feel when I start to, when I can be like kind of wandering around and like see like, oh, look, critical infrastructure that like you wouldn't otherwise notice. But sometimes I feel like this is still maybe like the response. This is like one of my favorite gifts in the history of the internet. This is maybe still like, why do you care? Like, what's at stake with knowing this part? Like, there's lots of other things that are crazy about the internet. How does this kind of factor into it? And for me, it kind of comes back to that point about like infrastructure being something you notice when it stops working. Because the other kind of deceptively simple question that I feel like I end up asking people a lot is like, do you think the internet's actually working right now? Like the internet as like we live with it today, is that the internet you were promised? Is that the internet that you expected, you know, 20 years ago? And I don't know if it totally is. And maybe I got the wrong idea from like bad cyberpunk manifestos. And maybe that idea needs to change, but it's kind of worth considering, like just throwing through, oh yeah. Once you kind of ask if something's working, what you actually are also asking is like, who does this work for? Who's benefiting from the way things work right now? This was just like kind of a side project that kind of is a nice maybe an illustration of what that means for the internet to work for like some and not others. So maybe back in like November, a German newspaper published a bunch of Snowden documents about GCHQ doing like cable interceptions on a bunch of submarine cables through a telecom company that was later bought by BT, which is like the big British telecom. And they actually published a list of like which cables they were like their partner cables and which ones weren't. And I said, oh, well, Telegeography published all this submarine cable data, and you just published this list, and you got chocolate in my peanut butter, and I made a map. And you can just kind of start like glancing through and seeing like what's like part of their network and what isn't. And that's sort of maybe an illustration, like for me that was like a way to illustrate like the scale at which a lot of this stuff works. The scale at which maybe like when you talk about government surveillance, like it's this very like abstract thing because it's not really happening to you, or like you don't see it happening to you. And that's probably because like that's where it happens, right? It happens in some building in like Mendocino County that's in the middle of nowhere in a town with a population of 400 people, and the ramifications are going to happen somewhere else. And making this stuff that like exists in the real world, for me at least, is useful for kind of trying to start going towards like where the harm's tangible. But that's like a very abstract example that maybe most likely doesn't affect a lot of people in this room, probably doesn't affect me. So what happens when you get a little lower? Like this is a graphic made by my friend Surya Matu, who I highly recommend you look up his work because he's fantastic. And he does a lot of stuff more on the wireless spectrum, like just creepy shit with, oh, I'm swearing if there are children. Okay, cool. But, you know, he made this like graphic basically say like, this is what I see when I look at people, because he spends a lot of time Wi-Fi sniffing and looking at networks people have previously used and kind of connecting the dots, and you can learn a lot about people just by looking at the wireless networks that they've been on. And if you're on that wireless network and you can kind of look at what they're doing, you can learn a lot about people. And that's at a much lower scale. It's going from like submarine cable down to like coffee shop Wi-Fi, right? But this stuff, like, it's leaky, and like power kind of exists in your ability to kind of like understand how it works and manipulate it. And maybe somewhere in between the submarine cable and the coffee shop is stuff that's at like a citywide level. There's tons and tons of sensors in New York and tons of different private networks that are doing different things for government agencies. And that's not stuff that people notice, understand, and maybe don't understand how that might be like becoming something larger, like this giant NYPD surveillance center that's in like lower Manhattan. I think it's a joint program that they did with Microsoft, and they like are reselling that software to like cities all over the country, which, Bloomberg, man. Anyway, I guess, I kind of threw this in at the last minute. When you also start thinking about kind of like who the network works for, I've been thinking about this sometimes in relation to like how networks get like distributed. So like, I don't know how many people here are familiar with internet.org, which is an initiative by Facebook to bring internet to parts of the developing world that don't have internet access. And there's this weird thing that happens when you read all their white papers or read any of their literature, where it feels kind of like they just had to do a find replace and put internet where Facebook would have normally been in a sentence. Like, most of their programs aren't necessarily about connecting people to the world and to like each other, or to be able to like build things. It's about getting people on Facebook. And I think about this a lot when you think about what it means to kind of like try and bring people to the internet. Like, are you just handing them a device and not handing them like kind of tools to understand what they're joining or what they're like kind of becoming a part of, and don't have really the agency to maybe change? So yeah, these are questions that I think a lot about with how do you make an internet that works for everyone? What does that even look like? And and for me, like, it's a very small piece is the part where you show them that it's a real thing, that it's like actually a bunch of objects. And they're objects that are all around you and you kind of could actually like pay attention to and that are part of your everyday life. It's a way to kind of make it a little less scary for some. So I think that's all I got, yeah. Oh, and then I threw in this other Adventure Time GIF. So, thanks. I know, yeah, no, I mean,
Actually, this is true. I had somebody ask me, where do you go to see the gig? And it seems pretty related to what you're talking about in New York. How would you answer the question?
like, where do you go to see the gig? Or, I mean,
City, we came here to Gig City. Where's the gig?
well, I was lucky enough to get to go to the EPB distribution center this morning, which was super fun. That part was just, and that was actually where I was told, I mean, every data center looks alike. It's like Anna Karenina, but for data centers. No one? All right, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear because like in a lot of like larger metropolitan areas, I would say if you wanted to go see the internet, I'd say like go to a carrier hotel, right? But like there isn't a carrier hotel here. So it's like for like bringing stuff to like the street level of like things like cable markings or like cell towers, that for me is like a useful way to say like, you actually can go pretty much anywhere and see the internet because it's like just a bunch of stuff that's all around you all the time. Hey, Nate.
So one of the things that I find totally fascinating about this, I think you nailed it with that slide that said visible equals legible.
Does not equal legible.
Not equal legible, but right. But you're surfacing like a design opportunity when you say that. Where do you go to see the gig? There's this opportunity because there's all of this infrastructure across the city. And so I wonder, have you seen any examples where there's like, rather than trying to hide stuff, put it away, where a city or entity has like really surfaced infrastructure and shown it off?
There's one project, I can't remember what city it is in, but I know it's in the UK, and the project's called Hello Lamppost. And basically, like, the project was taking advantage of the fact that, like, they had this smart grid of lampposts, and they had sensors, and you could see stuff going on with them at any given moment, and basically made an app for people, like if they were walking on the street and they found like a particular lamppost, they could like talk to it, and it would, you know, tell them things about what it was doing. Like that's like one example of just like a way of kind of like making infrastructure a little more like interactive. I wish I could tell you more details on that particular project because I can't remember who made it or exactly where it was, but it was, you know, very cute and British. I mean, in terms of like when you say that, I also think of like public works, like the like kind of spectacle around a certain kind of infrastructure that maybe existed when there was like heavy federal funding into that sort of stuff, or like the, you know, and sometimes that exists for other things, like you keep nagging me to go to the Raccoon Mountain Visitor Center, and I swear to God I will tomorrow, and it'll be great. But yeah, that's like, it's, you know, in some places, and this seems like a city that's like super stoked on its infrastructure, which has been super cool. Hiya. Yeah, that's something I just sort of started getting excited or looking into, partly because I was like planning to come down here and started just kind of looking at like, oh, like a lot of infrastructure sort of inherits infrastructure, especially when it has to do with like communications, and like so rail is like becomes like a fiber conduit, and the place where that's been super interesting, and I've just started to like kind of find cool pieces around that is abandoned railroads that are in like Bureau of Land Management property. So it's like they're basically like someone kind of owns that land, but like not really, and like you know, telecom companies will like use those rail lines for building out fiber optic networks, and then basically like people who say they have deeds from like 1872 on those railroads will come and sue the companies. It's like a very weird particular racket, but there is something to me that's kind of fascinating about like things that like, you know, former ghost towns being these conduits for like communications. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, there's also like an interesting parallel between like, you know, like post-Civil War when you had this like massive build out of the rail networks and this like massive kind of like boom around rail infrastructure, and then it kind of like drops off and everything gets consolidated. And I mean, in the 90s, you had a ton of people laying fiber. You had a lot of like little ISPs popping up who were like putting cables all over the place. And then the bubble crash, and then the basically like companies bought up all that fiber, and rather than like just improving access for everyone, turned it into dark fiber that they lease out. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And people can like get it and get interested in it, but not when it comes to fiber.
Oh, okay. So the sticker in this, that's actually, it was a sticker for a book that two of my friends wrote called The Inspection House, A Field Guide to Modern Surveillance. It's by Emily Horn and Tim Malley, and I recommend it. But I mean, I think where that, and that particular book, it's actually like a really deep reading of Jeremy Bentham's texts on the panopticon as a concept. So it's like visibility, meaning like just kind of like the structures that like, it's actually mostly just a book about prisons, but that's maybe getting a little further afield. In terms of like how much people like want to care about something, or like want to care about this topic, or like kind of willfully ignore it, is that kind of what your question was? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I feel like diagrams like that I don't think are particularly useful for like teach, like what they're useful for making someone feel like here's an overwhelming thing that you will never comprehend and that is like inaccessible. And like that's, I mean, it's true, like as a whole, like sure, okay, like probably like you know, you can't like you can't like necessarily comprehend the entire system in your head at once, but like it's really hard to get started if like that's your, like if your starting point is like this is impossible, which is one of the things like with visualizations like that I mean, and I think that's true for a lot of like network diagram visualizations. They're like a clever way to show that you know D3 and that like you want people to not know anything.
Anybody else have any other questions?
Really glad I put that GIF at the end.